it's good that we had a quote from Mark Twain the other day, because I think I became the physical embodiment of one of his other quotes, which is, it's better to keep your mouth shut and have the world wonder if you're a fool than to open it and remove all doubt. When I was asked to participate. People have come up and been very accommodating to me over the last couple of days, so I do appreciate that. I think Lauren's right. I mean, another Mark Twain quote from the beginning of Huckleberry Finn is, you don't know about me without you have read a book called The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Well, probably nobody would know about me without they know about Daisy Graham. When we put together the PowerPoint, it's at the end, but I'll just tell you very briefly how I got to know Daisy. I was working with another lawyer at the time. She called, apparently looking for me. How this was, I don't know, because the lawyer I was working with was far more well known. And she started telling me her story. Her case is in Butte County, California, which is way up north. In Oroville is the place where the court is, which everybody seems to think Northern California is this sort of la-la land when it comes to cannabis. Butte County is not. And they have kind of planted their flag, and they have particularly planted their flag on this issue of child endangerment related to marijuana growing, possession, etc. We were lucky enough in the beginnings of this case to actually get the fly on the wall information. There is a woman who is a judge in that county now, but when she was a prosecutor, she did a whole seminar for the DAs on the issue of child endangerment. That's the child stuff thing. She was very passionate about how it's a beautiful thing that that marijuana, medical marijuana doesn't protect people from child endangerment charges, and what a wonderful thing it is that we can kind of fold this thing together. She's just got a little bit more love for this. She's just a little bit too turned on by how they can really get people for this. And this county has turned itself into kind of ground zero for this in many ways. It's also the case, and I think Michelle might actually confirm this, it's also the case that, at least in that county, they are reimbursed by the federal government for each child that they take away and turn into an adoption. In other words, completely sever parental rights. And so they have an incentive. I mean, it's the sort of thing, when I first heard it, I thought, this sounds like one of those conspiracy theories, this can't be true. It is true. It's been confirmed by many people to me. And that seems to me to be the kind of thing that actually would offend the sensibilities of almost anybody. I mean, even people who, may have some doubts about, certain practices that people have, they're not going to like the idea that there's actually an incentive, a monetary incentive to separate parents and children. But anyway, so I got to meet Daisy. She came and spoke to myself, me and my legal assistant and I at the courthouse when we were there in another case. And, she just put her best foot forward. This is someone who obviously basically had no money. Her boyfriend was locked up in jail. Her children had been taken away, 2 of them at that time. She now has 3. And, she just walked into this conference room. She had a whole bunch of materials. She was carrying them like a schoolgirl, like this, across her chest. She was wearing a skirt and a sweater. This is someone who was really trying to present herself as someone who really wanted help, deserved it. And it took about 2 minutes. We decided we're taking this case pro bono. We don't care what the boss says about this. We're going to do this. I was shortly about to leave that practice anyways. And so she and I, well, that wasn't a for sure thing, but when it became even slightly contentious as to whether to continue with this case, the question was clear. And it's turned out to be a real journey. One of the things that occurred was when she and her boyfriend were being arrested, her children were being taken on the theory of, well, these people are being arrested, there's no one to care for their children, even though her boyfriend's mother was not far away. They wanted no part of that. They were there with the Child Protective Service as the arrest was being made. This was an arrest that was predicated on growing marijuana, and there was some evidence of honey oil around the apartment, around the house. And that was about it. The genesis of it was about 3 weeks before this arrest. There's been a compliance check done by some sheriffs who came up there to talk to these people, you know, about their growing. There's been a motion to suppress that's going to be renewed. The sort of legal details of some of this don't matter so much, but as her children were being taken, a recording was made, and she just was crying this primal cry, my babies, you're taking my babies, how are they going to eat? Because one of the allegations that was being made as this progressed was that she was poisoning them by nursing them, by virtue of her having used cannabis during a time when she was nursing her children. This, by the way, has not been proven in court, but it was one of the allegations that was at least up front being used against her. So they got this recording. Her boyfriend is representing himself. He got the recording, and it went viral on the internet. And within not a long period of time, she and I both were being contacted by, you know, I felt like the Joan Cusack character in broadcast news. Really famous people are calling me. I mean, we were getting calls from NPR. We were getting calls from what is I forget it. The radio network that Democracy Now! Is on. They wanted to interview us. Several. Pacifica. Yeah, that was it. And she wound up on the Dr. Drew show by herself, nursing her baby while Drew is talking to her. He, by the way, pointed out that he thinks that alcohol is the gateway drug, not marijuana, which actually, I think common sense actually says that's probably true. And so, in any event, she was facing cultivation, possession for sale charges, and child endangerment charges, 2 counts at that time on each child. We defeated those counts at prelim. We defeated the child endangerment counts. They since have refiled and brought in what they claim to be much better evidence. It hasn't really borne out that way. That prelim has been continued several times. She got pregnant again. She had another baby. There were problems with the people's expert witnesses. There were problems with our expert witnesses. And it actually is supposed to get going again within the next week or so. But, excuse me, having defeated those charges, her children were in, this is Butte County, her children were in the child protective legal system, which I think most people see as just like it's like on the other side of the looking glass. I mean, there are no rules. It's a Jabberwocky world where the standards change. She wound up representing herself there, essentially, and she'd been arrested in September. In December, she got her children back. And this was really a big deal, quite frankly, because I think for most of us that are exposed to this, that was basically unheard of, that, you know, they would have basically fooled their tent. They told her at the time, they told her privately, and it's been documented, they said, you know, you called our bluff. Because they had told her, look, give up the marijuana, give up the boyfriend, and frankly, she was getting this kind of advice from some people sort of in the community. She became quite popular, and still is in some cases amongst many of these people, and they were sending emails, you know, just do what they say and you'll get your children back. And she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not doing anything wrong, and I'm not going to say that I did. So they said to her, you know, you called her bluff. We just thought we could force you to give up using medical cannabis. And she said, no. And they couldn't sustain their case, so they gave the children back. They were free and clear to her. Now, unfortunately, I think in our business, some of us probably feel like who's the Greek character who has to roll the boulder up the hill? And Sisyphus, okay. I think we're like Sisyphus a lot of times because, you know, she has been arrested again and is facing new charges in another county, functionally the same. This time, I actually debated about whether I could just make it work on a pro bono basis, this new case in a new county. And then I guess, and I do not say this to pat myself on the back at all, I guess I just decided, you know, because some people were saying, you know, are you really sure you want to do this? And I basically said, you know, I mean, when you're a criminal defense lawyer, we don't really get to call to central casting to send us our clients. You know, we get them as they come to us. And if I'm going to be in for a dime, I'm going to be in for a dollar. I mean, maybe I'm mixing metaphors, but, you know, we have developed a friendship. We've developed mutual understanding. She's the second best legal assistant I've ever had in a courtroom. She sits next to me, she points at things. You know, a lot of times when we're defense lawyers and that client's poking you and trying to tell you something, you're like, you know, I'm focusing. She has an ability to pick the one thing that's going to make a difference oftentimes. So she's one of the few that'll go, okay, let me see that, you know. And so it's just one of those things. I'm just not going to walk away from her. We're going to walk this walk together for as long as it takes. Obviously, yes?
In a case like that, for you, would it be possible that you, as this plays out, go to retribution?
Retribution?
Yeah.
Meaning like a lawsuit? Well, she actually has, she's been lucky enough to become sort of befriended by the NORML Women's Alliance. And so they have undertaken to file a civil lawsuit on her behalf on the first time around. I mean, she obviously, honestly, and she'd be the first one to admit this, she's complicated matters for herself by being arrested again. This was not, you know, I mean, it doesn't help. Presumably, if the argument is, by the way, in the second preliminary hearing of this matter, the prosecutors conceded the fact, that is to say, in the preliminary hearing of this matter, of the new matter in the other county, they conceded that raw cannabis was not dangerous to children, which is actually one of the topics I wanted to talk about. So when you're dealing with child endangerment charges, there's sort of categories of things that they sort of go after. One is just the presence of raw cannabis and growing plants in a household. Now, as a general proposition, raw cannabis is not psychoactive. It has to be heated or decarboxylated is the term. It does have a small amount of negligible free THC in it. Otherwise, it's THCA, THC acid, and is not psychoactive. Over time, at room temperature, it will decarboxylate, but it can take a considerable period of time. So basically, having raw cannabis around is, you know, anybody who's a parent knows that children, you know, small children will probably pick up and put almost anything in their mouth once. But the other thing that's, and we've gotten testimony from expert witnesses about this, is that raw cannabis is just not palatable. It's not something that people eat, and particularly not to a child's palate. Sure, they might put it in their mouth, but it's going to taste terrible. It's dry, the consistency, and it's just not, it'd be like eating some raw plants in the backyard or something. Children don't do that. I mean, once in a while, they'll put it in their mouth and you'll see them spit it out. So that is genuinely not a danger. But one of the other things is they try to make the case. There are, yes? Well, I'm going to get to that, but why don't I just go right to that? Okay. What I was going to say is there is a category now of expert, quote-unquote experts that law enforcement uses, which are drug-endangered child experts. And, you know, of all the self-designated, you know, expertise, you know, that's one of them. And so I had, for example, an expert in a case who was talking about, that's in there somewhere, but the expert was talking about the grow chemicals being a danger. And the judge said, this was in a prelim in Riverside, and the judge stopped and he said, wait a second, you're talking about like fertilizer and, you know, stuff like that? He goes, yes. He says, well, I have that stuff at my house for my orchids. You're going to come and arrest me? And I was like, finally, there's a judge who really gets it, you know? And the cop was kind of like, well, no, but, you know. So those things, presumably any house has chemicals under the sink and the garage and the basement and the bathroom. And obviously, you want to use sensible precautions. I think Michelle will address best practices more accurately, but that is not really where the danger comes in. It is the case. This is where, okay, so you asked about BHO or honeoil or butane. Right, now, if raw cannabis is not dangerous, which it basically is not, it is the case that I do think, you know, whether it's life-threatening is another question, but I do think that many people would agree that concentrates put into edibles would be something that a child might eat, a brownie or a cookie, etc. And I actually did read the thing in the Denver paper about this. Go
I
ahead.
was actually pulling articles on NPR, and it's There's, yeah, I mean, there's literally a weekly story, and it is all about the edibles. It's
Yeah.
children and dogs getting into the brownies, the cookies, the lollipops, when
Yeah.
parents not paying attention.
And just in chatting with people over the last couple of days, I mean, there's a lot of people who have had the experience of seeing an edible that just looked great
Oh.
and eating too much of it and then just getting their head knocked off an hour later. Okay, so it's certainly not it's something you want to be clearly would want to be careful around children. Now, as it relates to manufacturing, at least in California, there is a specific statute against manufacturing by chemical extraction. And that has been held, and I think someone else in the materials here referred to the Bergen case, People versus Bergen. That is the case. That is illegal to do, even for medical purposes. And they define the chemicals as volatile chemicals, meaning chemicals that, volatile is defined as those that rapidly evaporate, okay? So, excuse me. It is illegal to do it that way, and it is potentially dangerous. I mean, if you're people who are using butane extraction are literally playing with fire, it is dangerous. That's not to say it shouldn't necessarily be done where it's legal to do, but it's probably not advisable to do around children. But this is one of the things that in the child stuff, I think it's page 9, where Judge Keithley, actually no, in the not my thing, but the other thing. Okay, well, in any event, she talks about the beauty of arresting somebody for the well, anyway, she talks about the beauty of it is that you can arrest somebody for manufacturing, and it's just a ready-made child endangerment case if there's just children in the house, and this is just such a beautiful thing for us. Yeah, there's the BHO case law, but where does she say it in here? Maybe it's the next page. She goes, the beauty is that we get to know. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
I wanted to share that there are, well, in Oregon it's not illegal to manufacture, and there is a company in Portland called Skunk Farm that manufactures Terminator, which is a self-contained butane extraction device, and so it negates a lot of the danger. And it just strikes me that in this kind of a case, if you have that kind of a device, then you're less at risk to these kinds of charges.
I would agree with that. I don't know that that specific device has been tested in the courts, but using volatile chemicals as a general proposition is not allowed. Now, actually, somebody could maybe answer this for me, because I hear about CO2 extraction all the time. As far as I know, that is not a volatile chemical. It is not a dangerous form of, it is a chemical extraction, quote unquote. That issue's not been tested in California courts either, but I think it would probably pass muster because it's not something that's going to basically blow up or cause a fire, yes.
Well, but that's only half fair, because the state they put the CO2 in is under a state of, it's not a normal state for CO2, so.
Explain that, because I don't know. I honestly don't know. I should, but I don't.
About temperature and pressure, right, that brings the CO2 to a special state where you can do the extraction.
So a spark is going to cause a...
I don't know if it's spark.
I'm not sure either. I know that the same place has a self-contained CO2 extractor as well. I think there are some dangers.
So tremendous pressures are involved. So.
I still think it involves evaporation.
Say again?
Evaporation.
Okay.
Rapid evaporation, yeah.
So it really
I
is
think
the
it's
same.
still mine, so
Okay.
it could fall under there.
Yes, sir.
I have a case right now. I think I have the only BHO case in Wisconsin, and they've also charged my client with possession of improvised explosive device,
Ooh.
and they have him on $150,000 cash.
Not on.
And I've had 3 hearings on bond reduction. I can't get a judge to move on it because Milwaukee Journal reported it as the guy was making bombs.
Well,
Any
what
case of it being part of Al-Qaeda yet?
No.
Okay.
After this question, can you also comment on the issue of how best arguments for prosecutors in child abuse and child endangerment cases where they're growing and they're basing it on the chemical, or you having plants in your house that they don't like?
I mean, the arguments to oppose this?
The arguments of why it's a BS case and how to get
Yeah,
the
yeah.
case dismissed.
Well, basically, I think what you're pointing out is evidence of how, what this ultimately is an extremely emotionally charged issue. of the entire thing. So what prosecutors do, it allows them to get creative, and it's basically what you were saying, which is, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's marijuana, maybe it's medical. But there are children there. Now we can take what those people made that legal, kind of, but we can get them because they must be doing something wrong to their children. And to take an extraction case and make it into an explosive device case.
There were no kids, so we made it an explosive case.
Fair, right, exactly. But people will shrug their shoulders and go, well, that sounds really dangerous, So it plays upon, and when it comes to children-related issues, and I think the approach that I try to take with this is, let's just put it this way. I mean, there is nothing, in my opinion, really, there's nothing worse that you can accuse someone of than doing something to harm their own children. It's just so basic. It's the kind of thing that hits people so hard. It takes on a life of its own. It's just to even be accused, to be suspected of that is such a stigmatizing thing. It's such a, and it gets people off, it destabilizes anyone when that suggestion is even made, which means that police use it. Tell us about your husband, or we can take these children, or, if he doesn't admit this, these children are going to CPS, or one of 1,000 varieties of this, okay? And people are like paralyzed. They don't know what to do when they're being encountered by this. Excuse me. And the same thing can happen in the courts. But I think the most effective thing to do, quite honestly, is really, it is kind of with any litigation, and I'm not going to pretend to be the expert litigator, but I will say this. Generally, I think you need, to the degree to which you can, to take as much emotion out of that as you can by simply focusing on the facts. So, for example, in the second preliminary hearing in Butte County relating to Daisy Graham, they brought in a doctor this time, a drug-endangered expert doctor, a pediatrician, who claimed that in her clinical practice, she had treated 10 children who had eaten raw cannabis, gotten extremely ill, and tested positive for THC. And so I asked her several questions, and by the way, she also had no scientific basis for this. She had no study to cite. She had no scientific journal or article to cite. She just said, this is what happened. Excuse me. So I asked her several questions just to bear it down. Well, do you know whether raw cannabis contains THC? Her answer, that's not within my area of expertise. Do you know the mechanism by which raw cannabis or THC would cause illness to a child? That's not within my area of expertise. She actually said that enough times, or said she didn't know enough times, that when my 10-year-old son, Elijah, the prophet from Passover, was reading it, he said, this person says, I don't know so much, she doesn't deserve a doctor's certificate. And I'm thinking, if a 10-year-old can get this, so in any event, but I think that's what you have to do. So you have to just bit by bit, honestly point out, and of course the classic, all the really great trial lawyers here, the guys from Oklahoma and all the other people, they'll tell you, look, the way is to kind of do a little jujitsu. You take the opponent's power and kind of reverse it. So you say, okay, there was raw cannabis, but do you know whether it causes harm? Or, better yet, what I was lucky enough to be able to do in Daisy's case was point out that they noticed nothing wrong with the children. There was no deficit. They were perfectly active. They never went near the cannabis that had been dropped on the floor when they were raiding the place. They were happy. They were healthy. They tried to sneak in a couple of lab tests, and their chain of custody was so pathetic that it didn't work. So, I mean, really, that is what you have to do. You just approach it the way you approach all litigation. And, you point out what's good for you and what's not there, which is actual harm to the children, let us say. And then you try to point out that the mere presence of any number of things all by itself is not really the issue. It's because what would have to be coupled with any of that would be a great deal of inattention from a parent. I mean, certainly there are, yes, ma'am?
Are they testing children?
Well, if they take them away, they will generally do a hair follicle test, which has a test of some limited value. At least in California, they try to send these hair follicles to Kansas for a test, and the chain of custody is like non-existent, which really helpful in a criminal case. It apparently doesn't impress juvenile dependency judges much because they just don't care about that. I probably should get going here. There are any number of other topics, but one of the other things that I would point out is that another sort of tack that they're taking now that they're realizing that, you know, lawyers can point out that cannabis itself is not harmful, is they'll say, well, growing cannabis makes the home more dangerous because it's more likely to be burglarized. And I actually had the detective in Daisy Bram's case that a cannabis grow is more likely A, to be burglarized, and B, to lead to a violent burglary because because people are less likely to report this to law enforcement if they think, because they know, even if they're growing it medically. So he actually testified that the latent sociopathological sadism of a burglar that would not be invoked in robbing a house for its jewels would be invoked by virtue of burglarizing a home because cannabis was being grown there. He literally said this was true. The judge in that particular case didn't buy it. Okay, so I think Michelle has a lot more sort of very good information. I know she has a lot more information about best practices, but I think as attorneys we just need to really kind of, you know, internalize the idea that this is something that is really, this is a true injustice. The fact that something that someone is doing legally and being careful about and that is not causing harm is really suffering from the stigma that's attached to the use of cannabis as opposed to any number of other things that are infinitely more harmful. And that alone is being morphed into endangerment. And you have to just kind of deconstruct it bit by bit. And now I'll let Michelle take the stage.